Workers' compensation is a form of insurance for people who get hurt or sick because of their jobs. This means that if something happens to you because of what you do at work, this program will help pay your medical bills and give you money if you can't work for a while. This is a good way to make sure that workers are taken care of without further delay. The U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Workers' Compensation Programs, OWCCAC, mainly helps federal workers and some special groups by offering money to replace lost wages, medical care, assistance in getting back to work, and if some other types of assistance. For state employees and those who work in the commercial sector, workers' compensation is administered at the state level, not by the federal government. Each state has its own workers' compensation insurance program. For example, workers' compensation in New York, which provides benefits to injured workers. These benefits may also include payment for lost wages if you can't work because of your injury or illness, medical benefits to help pay for medical treatment, rehabilitation services to help get back to work. To review the types of available benefits in New York, for instance, please follow this link. Matthew is a zookeeper at a local zoo. His job is to feed and care for various animals. One day, while preparing food in the storage room, a shelf broke and fell on him, causing a serious shoulder injury and several cuts. The accident happened because the rack was overloaded and not inspected for safety since last century. Now, Matthew thinks suing the zoo for failing to make sure that the storage room was safe. However, his supervisor guy who reads some articles on Medium tells him that he can't because his injury is covered by workers' compensation. Is the supervisor right? Coverage of workers' compensation is. Matthew's supervisor is correct. Employees are generally barred from suing their employers for injuries covered by the system. This is part of a trade-off within the workers' compensation system. Employees get faster and guaranteed benefits without having to prove employer negligence, and in return, they lose the right to sue their employer for those injuries. There are three main criteria that must be met to qualify for compensation. Injury shall be accidental. Matthew's situation clearly falls into the category of an accidental injury. It was unexpected, occurred at a specific time and place while preparing food in the storage room, and resulted directly from an action related to his job. The shelf fell due to overloading. It shall happen while performing employment duties. The injury occurred while Matthew was performing his direct responsibilities. He was at his workplace performing tasks that are part of his job description as a zookeeper. This connection to his employment satisfies this requirement injury arise out of, and in the course of employment. The fact that he was working at the time and place where the injury occurred makes his case eligible for workers' compensation. It arises out of employment. The injury arose out of his employment because it was related to the conditions and hazards of his job. The unsafe storage area that wasn't inspected for safety is directly related to his work environment. Therefore, the risk of injury from such conditions is considered part of his employment. So, Matthew's injury qualifies for workers' compensation benefits to cover medical expenses, a portion of lost wages, and possibly other forms of rehabilitation or assistance needed to recover and return to work. Correct assessment of work-related injury risks. No, it helped Matthew to examine how his injury fits into the three tests for work-related risks. These tests are important because they help determine whether a worker should get compensation benefits at all. They make it clear when an employer is responsible for an injury and ensure that only work-related injuries are covered, which also protects the employer's interests to some extent. The increased risk test. Matthew's job as a zookeeper required him to work in an environment with unique hazards, such as the storage room with an overloaded and unchecked rack. This environment exposed him to a higher risk of injury than the general public would typically face. The general public does not regularly work in zoo storage rooms with the potential for falling objects. Correct me, please, if I am wrong, showing that Matthew's risk of injury was increased by his working conditions. Actual risk test. The actual circumstances of Matthew's employment directly exposed him to the hazard that caused his injury. The fact that he was required to be in the storage room, a specific location where the shelf broke and fell on him, demonstrates that his job duties directly exposed him to the hazard that caused his injury. Unlike the increased risk test, this test focuses on whether the employment situation presented the specific risk, without regard to the magnitude of the risk. In Matthew's case, his employment required interaction with the warehouse environment, which led directly to his exposure to the risk. Positional risk test: Matthew's injury would not have occurred if his job did not require him to be in the specific location where the accident occurred. His duties as a zookeeper required his presence in various parts of the zoo, including the storage room where the shelf collapse occurred. This test focuses on the role of the employment in placing the employee at the site of the injury, and assumes that Matthew would not have been in the dangerous situation, but for his job duties. Under all three tests, Matthew's injuries are directly related to his employment at the zoo. His job exposed him to specific hazards not faced by the general public. Increased risk: his job directly placed him in the risky situation that caused his injury. Actual risk: his injury occurred in a place where his job duties required him to be. Positional risk: thus, applying these tests to Matthew's unfortunate case confirms that his injuries are considered to have arisen out of and in the course of his employment, 100% qualifying him for workers' compensation benefits. Personal health conditions vs. employment-related injury. Suppose Matthew has a pre-existing condition with his shoulder injury that he aggravated while working at the zoo. While lifting a heavy sack of food, his old shoulder injury flares up, causing him pain and requiring medical attention. Personal risk assessment: at first glance, this situation may seem to result from a personal risk, the pre-existing shoulder condition. Since Matthew's shoulder could have been aggravated by various non-work-related circumstances, it could be argued that this injury wasn't directly caused by his employment, but rather by his personal medical history. Occupational risk consideration: where the context changes when the nature of Matthew's job is considered. If the task of lifting heavy sacks of feed is a routine part of his job, and this particular activity is aggravating his shoulder condition, then the injury can be viewed through the work-related risk. This shifts the situation from a purely personal risk to where the conditions of employment requiring the handling of heavy materials played a significant role in the occurrence of the injury. Application of the increased risk test: under the increased risk test, if Matthew's job involves more frequent and strenuous physical activity than the general population, or even his non-work activities, then his employment has indeed increased the risk that his pre-existing condition will lead to injury. If so, the risk isn't just personal. Our main question is whether Matthew's job duties significantly contributed to the risk of his injury. If his daily duties at the zoo put him in situations where his pre-existing condition is more likely to lead to injury, then the injury could be considered to have arisen out of and in the course of his employment. Typically, determining workers' compensation eligibility involves a detailed examination of the relationship between the employee's personal health risks and his or her job duties. If a pre-existing condition is aggravated or becomes symptomatic due to work-related activities, the injury may indeed fall under work-related risks and qualify for workers' compensation benefits. Such determinations almost always require careful analysis and may vary based on the specific details of each case and a particular court's interpretation of the relevant workers' compensation laws.